PortAventura World is a theme park resort located in Salou, Spain. It was built around the original PortAventura park, which had become one of the most visited theme parks in Europe. Due to its success, the property expanded to include hotels, a water park, and a secondary theme park called Ferrariland. This one would be much smaller than the main park, but as with PortAventura's other expansions, it encouraged visitors to spend multiple days at the resort. And I think they generally succeeded in that. Had we been more flexible with time, I'm sure we would have spent 2 or 3 days at the resort. But because of time constraints, we had to pack in everything into a 1-day itinerary. Now, if you're like me and want to ride each of the resort's 10 roller coasters, several of its flat rides, and experience walkthroughs and shows, you'll need to fork in the money for Express Pass. It'll cost you about €100, but you won't need to wait in any lines whatsoever. Don't get me wrong, it's amazing once you have this, but it's unfortunate that the park basically forces you into this option because of their intentionally slow operations and arbitrary park policy. But that's a topic for another video. What we're here to talk about today is PortAventura World's roller coaster collection, and it's a dang good one. Between the main PortAventura park and Ferrariland, there are 10 separate coasters here, 8 at the former park and 2 at the latter park. And it seems they've really taken the time to evaluate what roller coasters are best fit for the resort. For the most part, each of these rides seem absolutely necessary for the park to have as they fill in one gap or another. So understand that the worst coasters on this list aren't even bad rides, it just so happens that some are geared towards my target audience and some aren't. So with that being said, at the number 10 spot we have Junior Red Force. The first of 2 coasters at the Ferrariland park, I'm sure you could guess what the other is called. Junior Red Force is the smallest roller coaster in the entire resort. It was manufactured by SBF Visa and is their relatively rare race coaster model. And no, it's not a racing coaster, that would certainly be pretty cool though. This model fits in a very small footprint and looks minuscule next to its big brother Red Force. But that's exactly what it's meant to be, a small coaster that can prep young kids for bigger and bigger rides. Though I personally don't find much enjoyment in rides like this anymore, I have ridden many kiddie coasters and can say with full confidence that this one isn't half bad. For some reason, so many of them tend to be rough rides, but Junior Red Force is not bad. Number 9, Tammy Tammy. Making our way to the main PortAventura park, we have Tammy Tammy, which acts as this park's kids coaster. Manufactured by Vekoma, you can find this exact layout at several parks in Europe and across America. Typically, I find these both boring and uncomfortable, but PortAventura took the time to make this look beautiful. From both on and off ride, Tammy Tammy is an engaging little ride with a gorgeous setting. It feels like you're in a tropical forest, which is exactly the theme they were going for. In terms of comfort, that's something you can't exactly improve by just adding in theming, so this still isn't a perfect kids coaster. But it's far better than average, which is why this is the best ride on this list for kids. Number 8, Diablo Tren de la Mina. Fun fact, Europe only ever installed one aerodynamics mine train, and this was it. At first, Diablo looked very nicely presented with a cool layout, but it's really not so great in my opinion. It's got 3 lift hills, and it's got a fair bit of track in between all of them, but I just found the ride course to be pretty underwhelming even compared to other mine trains. It felt like it was doing a whole lot of nothing. Easily the best part was this sizable twisting drop at the end which passes beneath ground level. I thought that was pretty fun, but just as the ride gets going, it ends, and that's a shame. It's still a decent fit in the park's lineup with it being the only steel family coaster in the resort, but objectively, it's probably the weakest coaster in the park. Only reason it's not lower is because I personally find more enjoyment in something like this than any kids coaster. Number 7, Tomahawk. In the western section of PortAventura lies 2, technically 3 wooden coasters with track flying every which way. It's actually hard to tell which ride is which, and that's a pretty cool visual. But it becomes abundantly obvious that there is a difference after riding, and that's that Tomahawk is a family wooden coaster. It was manufactured by Custom Coasters International, but now runs with trains from Great Coasters International. This wasn't a combination I thought I'd like so much, but I sort of wish this were the case on the park's larger wood coaster, Stampede. Anyways, Tomahawk is quite the enjoyable ride considering its small stature. It's not going to offer any crazy airtime, but it does have some faint lateral forces and moments where it builds up some speed. In many ways, it reminds me a lot of another CCI coaster we have here in America, and that's Pegasus at Mount Olympus in Wisconsin. Only difference is Tomahawk is maintained far better and has the more comfortable GCI trains. But you can definitely see similarities in these lateral turns, which are super weird. If there is a downside to Tomahawk, the coaster is only 1,400 feet long, so it is pretty short, but you aren't going very fast most of the time, so it's probably not as bad as I'm making it out to be. Though it's not meant for my crowd, I did enjoy it for what it was, and I think it's a great option for families. Number 6, Stampede. The way I view Stampede is it's basically a larger version of Tomahawk. Where that ride introduces laterals, Stampede is focused almost entirely on laterals. There are several moments where this coaster flies around a mostly unbanked turn, which then pins riders to the side of the train. With this being a full-size CCI coaster, laterals were an expectation of mine, and I'm happy to say that Stampede delivered on that front. But in several other ways, I can't help but say that Stampede was less intense than some made it out to be. It's certainly not as tame as something like Tomahawk, that would defeat the point of having those 2 rides in the same park, but it was one of the weaker CCI coasters I've done, and I think that could have been fixed if the layout was taken with a bit more speed. I'm not sure how that would affect the unbanked turns with the laterals, but I think it would have benefited the rest of the ride for sure. As is, you don't don't really get a whole lot of airtime on the drops. Now, something that compensates for all this is the ride's racing feature. Having 2 trains duel was a super neat touch, and I think it's what kept Stampede from being an underwhelming coaster. This is a good fun ride overall, but I wish the park had built a more impressive wooden racing coaster. If you ask me, even something like Lightning Racer at Hershey Park is much better, even though most consider that ride to be forgettable. Just my preference, I guess. It's not that Stampede was rough or uncomfortable, I personally just wished it packed in more of a punch. Number 5, Uncharted. The newest roller coaster to open at the resort, which made its grand debut earlier this year, Uncharted was absolutely one of the rides I was most looking forward to. In many ways, I'd say it met those expectations and perhaps exceeded them, but in others, left a lot to be desired. And that mainly has to do with the theming. Uncharted is an indoor roller coaster that uses first of its kind technology from Intamin. The total cost came out to 25 million euros, and so I think because the design and layout was already so expensive, they decided to cheap out on the theming. Now, that doesn't mean they won't ever go back and update some things in the future. I sure hope they do, but as it stands, Uncharted really doesn't got a whole lot going on inside that building. On the other hand, this is probably one of, if not the greatest layout I've experienced on an indoor coaster. Riders will experience 5 launches, a backward section, and several moments of airtime, which I was so impressed PortAventura was able to fit into such a small building. Really, how much you like this ride is going to come down to your expectations. If you're anticipating an awesome layout with surprising elements but little to no theming, I think you'll really enjoy Uncharted. I for one had a lot of fun with it, and I would have gladly ridden it again if it had a shorter line and hadn't broken down so many times. Number 4, Dragon Con. Opening in 1995 and becoming the first roller coaster in the world to flip riders upside down 8 times, Dragon Con has become quite the iconic coaster. Even now, with Shambhala towering overhead, this is still a dang phonogenic ride on its own. And personally, I thought it rode well too, but that's contrary to what Josiah from National Coasters felt as he rode beside me. He found Dragon Con to track poorly but have good positive forces. For me, I sort of felt the opposite. I found Dragon Con to be relatively smooth and have good forces, but not great forces, like its sister ride halfway across the world, Kumba at Busch Gardens, Tampa. And I'm not sure why that is. The elements, profiling, and trains are all nearly identical to that of Kumba, but I just think that ride is magical in the way it runs. It's so much more intense than it has any right to be. I think Dragon Con's layout is overall very satisfying. You've got 5 inversions in the first half, some of which are better than others, with my favorite being the 0G roll. Then you hit a mid-course brake run to increase capacity and dive into your final 3 inversions. And you're not going to find many unique elements in comparison to other B&M loopers. So I think if you've ridden Kumba and a bunch of floorless coasters by B&M, you could come off Dragon Con unimpressed. But personally, I appreciated this ride a lot. I think it's iconic, I think it rides well, and I think it's an integral part of PortAventura's coaster lineup. Number 3, Furious Baco. As we enter the top 3, we get to the rides I really fell in love with at the resort, and Furious Baco is one that I'm so pleased I did. It's developed a pretty polarizing reputation, with some people loving it and some people hating it. The main reason for people disliking this ride is because they think it's rough. Now, if you've been watching my videos for a while, you know that I have a pretty high tolerance for roughness, and sure enough, I didn't think Furious Baco was that bad. It's far from smooth, but I've ridden tons of coasters shakier than this. The ride begins with an incredible hydraulic launch, blasting riders to 83.9 miles per hour in 3.5 seconds. It's so rare that you see these nowadays, and this one is easily one of my new favorites. From here, Furious Baco stays low to the ground through S-bends, a single inversion, which is a great element by the way, and a swooping turn over the water. It's no doubt a very short ride, and that's certainly my biggest complaint with it. But I've said it once, and I'll say it again, I'd much rather ride a short coaster that's good the whole way through than a long coaster that doesn't do a whole lot. Plus, if you view it as an intimate accelerator coaster in line with rides such as Accelerator at Knott's Berry Farm and King Ka at Six Flags Great Adventure, it actually packs in a decent amount of elements after the launch. So really, I can't complain too much. Really fun ride. Number 2, Shambhala. What I'm guessing will be most people's number 1 coaster in the resort, Shambhala is without question an incredible ride. If this were at just about any other park, it would be my favorite ride there. And while it was close for PortAventura World, I had to make a tough call. Standing an enormous 249 feet tall with a drop of 256 feet, Shambhala is the tallest hypercoaster B&M ever built. And the majority of people who have ridden it would argue that it's also the best. And for me, it was super close, but I do still prefer Goliath at Six Flags over Georgia. I know I'm in the minority there, but I just think that ride is incredible. They are only a few spots apart though, and that should hopefully speak volumes for how much I enjoyed Shambhala. It's chock full of these large parabolic hills that deliver absolutely amazing doses of sustained airtime. To spice things up, there's also a really fun and long turnaround section and a speed hill, which delivers a great moment of ejector airtime. If I had to change anything about this ride, the mid-course brake run does take away from the pacing and finale of the coaster, though I do understand why it's there to increase capacity. I'd also trade 1 or 2 of those large hills for smaller sustained ejector hills like what you see on Goliath, but that's not much of a complaint, that's more just personal preference. If I'm struggling to find things I dislike about a coaster, that should tell you that it's nearly a perfect ride. Objectively, it may be the best roller coaster in the resort, but for me, I do prefer an insane balls-to-the-wall ride, which is why my number 1 coaster at PortAventura World is Red Force. Now, I'm just gonna go ahead and say this, if you're familiar with my obsession for the Intamin Strata coasters, King Ka at Six Flags Great Adventure, and Top Thrill Dragster at Cedar Point, then this ranking shouldn't come come as too much of a surprise. Those coasters are short, but they have an insane launch, a stupid tall top hat, and a drop into the brakes. It's a simple concept, but it's executed to perfection and so intense. Going in, I knew Red Force would be slightly toned down in comparison, with its LSM launch instead of hydraulics and its 50 foot or so of less height. But these differences aren't noticeable enough to keep this ride from a high overall ranking. Red Force's 111 mph LSM launch may not be quite as insane as the hydraulic accelerations, but it's still one of the best coaster elements I've experienced, particularly if you're in the front row. It's a damn shame they don't allow seating requests here, but if you're lucky enough to score a front row ride on Red Force, I think you'll really see where I'm coming from with this ranking. In any other row, I might take Shambhala over this, but a front row ride is a leaps and bounds the best coaster experience at PortAventura World. I'll also say Red Force doesn't seem that much shorter than Dragster or King Naka, because 367 feet tall is still absolutely huge. So this makes it the tallest coaster by height and drop on the continent, and that drop goes on forever. It might honestly be the one thing I prefer with Red Force is the fact that it doesn't spiral all the way to the bottom. I find that this drop encapsulates the feeling that you're falling more than 300 feet, and that's an awesome sensation. But yeah, that's just my opinion. So with that, I'd love to hear what you guys think as to what the best coasters at PortAventura World are. And if you haven't visited before, let me know which of these rides are highest on your bucket list. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave me a like and subscribe to Coaster Dash for more content like this in the future. Until next time, I'll see you all very soon. Bye guys.